Hello and welcome to HD Philosophy, the channel where we take some time with the classics to awaken the hidden dragon within all of you. And this is episode 3 of the Gospel Meditations, where I outline and discuss the insights from my family breakfast, where we meditate on this week's gospel message. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the ranked matches as we meditate on Philippians 4:4-7 in the NIV.
Let's go!
Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and your minds in Christ Jesus. Here we see something fascinating in the characteristics of worry, prayer, and peace. We will start with worry, as this is something Pastor Sheldon Lacsina focused on. As there's a difference between like worry that leads to concern and then worry that is much more pathological in nature. So worry that leads to concern. This is often the case when we worry about something that we can actually fix, you know? For example, I jump in my truck and I need to go to town from the mountain, and I start up the vehicle and I look at my gas meter and it's really close to empty, you know? So then I get this worry, will I make it to town? And it's like, well, I may not, but I have an option here. I can just go fill up the truck and then I don't have to worry anymore. The worry led to a concern. The concern led to possible solutions. And once I addressed the solution as it was within my control, I found peace. No longer needed to worry about it. You see? In this sense, obviously, worry is very necessary because I need to be able to see where certain trouble may spring up. You know, one of my favorite metaphors is I need to be able to see the snake in the garden, you know? It's this proverbial snake in the garden is kind of this chaos that likes to spring up. I think about it as like atrophy in the state or a new sound in my truck that may induce worry. So I may need to check it out instead of ignoring it. And I like the idea of the snake in the garden because it's almost like this autonomous being that's waiting for its perfect opportunity to strike. Because of course, when we ignore that new check engine light, it never breaks down when I'm just on a nice cruise or something like that. It always breaks down when I'm late to a meeting or a really important interview or something like that, right? It always strikes at the worst time. Shout out to Mufasa, right? Ignoring the chaos in his own kingdom in the metaphor of Scar, who eventually waits for the perfect opportunity to take him out, right? So in that sense, worry is absolutely necessary. It's necessary for us to be able to see the proverbial snakes in the garden. But there are some types of worry that is absolutely pathological. As many of you know, my son has recently gone to boot camp. So my wife and I worrying about my son's flight over. Like, really, what can we do? We didn't build the plane. We don't know the pilot. There's nothing we can do in that situation. I also worry about his division, Are there going to be a bunch of good kids there or are there going to be a bunch of troublemakers, This is not within my control whatsoever. I worry about my daughter's teachers at the local university whose standards have hit rock bottom. But what can I do about her teachers, And there's often this, it's outside of my control, so what's the point of worrying about it, But then at the same time, after the sermon, my wife and I are discussing again over breakfast, and she was like, this was a great sermon for her because when she heard about the things that might be outside of her control, she was like, I always feel like I can do something. And she knows that, her kids mean everything to her. So she knows she's much more of a helicopter parent than I am. But it comes from that concept of she always feels like there's something that she can do, And then she gave an example of the tsunami that hit Hawaii recently. Just to be quick, my son was actually on an airplane when we got the tsunami warning that we had an impending tsunami. And for some reason, the plane took off. And my wife and I were like, oh my God, they're going to land in Honolulu Airport during an evacuation in a red zone. And red zones in Hawaii are the areas that you need to evacuate. You're in a danger zone. And people would look at that and think, there's nothing that you can do. This is all outside of your control. But she knew there was something we could do. So she called family that we had over there. I called family that we had over there. She got in touch with the petty officer that was in charge of the whole thing. And when my son landed, as we knew it would be, the entire airport was shut down. So there was no taxis coming out of that airport. Everybody was evacuating that red zone. And yet we had cousins on standby heading over to the airport to pick him up. And then eventually the petty officer let us know that he got in touch with the rental agency, got my son out of the airport into a hotel where he was able to evacuate vertically. But she was like, look, a lot of people would have looked at that situation and said, like, there's nothing I can do. This is completely out of my control. And I said, no, that was absolutely something we could do. We had the wisdom to see that something was in our control, and we had backup just in case. Of course, I'm reaching into my stoic handbag here, my Epictetus dichotomy of control handbag, where I'm like, there's wisdom in understanding the difference between that which is in our control and that which is outside of our control. And it kind of lines up with what Pastor Sheldon was talking about today. It's like the things that are within our control, well, then the worry becomes a concern because it's much more tangible in that there's something we can do. But then when it's absolutely outside of our control, that's when it becomes pathological, So then back to Philippians, it's like, what do you do with the worry that's outside of your control, Well, for Philippians, it talks about prayer, but what is it about prayer itself that allows us to kind of transcend that worry and that pathology? Well, for this, I'm often reminded of the difference between what we call in philosophy autonomous versus theonomous. So autonomous means my will. It specifically translated, autonomos is my law, So if it's my will and my law, I feel like I'm in control of everything. But there's also this aspect of theonomos, which is God's will, And where Pastor Sheldon took it was often the pathology from worry comes from a lack of faith. And that's what I find fascinating here, because he linked the pathology. He linked what happens when we're worrying about things that are outside of our control to a lack of faith. So consider this. When it's full autonomy, when it's full autonomos, when I'm kind of in that area, well, then everything is my law, my will, my control. I'm thinking of Benjamin Franklin, who once wrote, one who is wrapped up in himself makes for a small package, But then I'm also considering what Dr. Hamilton recently studied in the brain scans of the depression and self-reflection. What they found was a constant thinking about oneself, a constant self-reflection can often be hijacked in maladaptive ways and form or produce depression. So think about what that means. The same region of the brain that's often just focusing on self-reflection, self-control, self-aggrandizement is the same area that leads to depression. And it's like, I think there's something here in Philippians that has a grasp on this. Constantly thinking of my will, my choices, and my law, in a way, puts myself as the center of my world, Then God almost becomes an extension of me. This is fascinating because this is something Bishop Robert Barron talked about in his sermon this week. The difference between God revolving around me as me in the center of like an autonomous being, or me revolving around God, where God is the center. And of course, the solution in Philippians is prayer to induce a certain kind of peace, but it's a specific kind of prayer. And I think this prayer is really linked to this seeing God as the center and me revolving around him. It's the prayer of thanksgiving, as it says in Philippians. God's at the center. And when I'm thanking God for his grace and his majesty, I'm taking that self-aggrandizement out of it that often comes with autonomy, and I'm placing my faith in the will of God, thanking him for the road that he has in store for me. That's the difference between the theonomous and the autonomy. And sometimes I think this really gets in the way when something is just absolutely beyond our control and we still think we have control. This is the Stoic conception of this leading to a suffering. It's this conception of the area in my brain that's just leading to depression. I mean, John Calvin famously states in his text, The Institutes, that since therefore men, one and all, perceive that there is a God and that he is their maker, they are condemned by their own testimony because they have failed to honor him and to consecrate their lives to his will. This again is what we find in Philippians. So what's the option here? What can we do? As my wife and I discussed, we both worry about my son constantly. And as we continue to worry about these things that are outside of our control, we were just overcome with sorrow. And this sermon was just a godsend this week, because what is the solution in Philippians? Well, it's prayer to induce peace, the peace that you will find in Christ Jesus. Continued prayer is giving us peace, for our minds turn away from that which we cannot control to God's grace and thanksgiving for the many blessings in our lives. And through prayer, we continue to walk his path. And to be in his path is to find peace. Or as Augustine so beautifully put it, our heart is restless until it rests in you.
These are some fighters who know their stuff. Amazing. Don't point at me. Don't point at me. I won't lose to anyone.
Thank you for watching HD Philosophy. Like, share, and subscribe.